Nice to be back at Carleton. So I'm wearing these crazy goggles. So we do a lot of testing of websites for accessibility, and when people tend to think about people living with disabilities, they tend to think about the extremes, like someone who's completely blind, someone who's never seen and may never see, or someone who's can't hear at all. But in fact, the vast majority of disability is subtler than that. And in fact, when we're designing for the extremes, we're typically designing for everyone in between, what we would call typical, all the way out to the edges. So there's this doctor in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who developed this kit, and it's a set of goggles that you can simulate various visual challenges. And so I'm wearing these goggles, have kind of a Trailer Park Boys Coke bottle 2800 vision simulation on one side, and this is a cone that limits my vision to about 8 degrees. And so you can mix and match. Here, Lois, you want to try on a pair of these? Okay, so what do you got there? You see, and the kit allows you to do things like simulate color deficiencies, and so you got the goggles. Actually, I'll pass the whole thing around. You guys can try on the goggles and play with them and stuff, and take pictures of each other and tweet it up. Here, take the whole kit, please. Yeah, so Dr. Zimmerman, here's my cat. This is my cat, Spice. She's wearing a simulation of macular degeneration for, so here, I'll pass the cat around too. Spice has been to one more country in the world than I have. And so looking for remote mouse, there we go. So the thing is that it's true what Lois said. I'm back. I'm back because I actually went to Carleton what seems a long time ago, and I'm involved in a number of things having to do with inclusive design at Carleton. But way back when I was here for real, I was working at the Charlatan, and so the Charlatan had this coverage of me coming back. But I said, no, that's not the Charlatan. I know the Charlatan. I know it looked like this. I'm really aging myself. I pulled up this is the bound volume from when I used to work on the paper. And the thing, when we talked about collaboration then, I don't know, how many of you have heard of the Paul Menton Center on the 5th floor of the Unicenter? So, you know, when I was, well, you know, the Charlatan's also on the 5th floor of the Unicenter, except back then when if you wandered down to that end of the hallway, there was no Paul Menton Center. There was just a place where the CKCU people would go to amuse themselves. And so it's called Studio K, and Studio J was at the other end. So the thing was that back then, though, the collaboration was that you'd actually put the paper out right there in this room. Because right now, people file their stories from anywhere in the world. But back then, we would get together at the Charlatan, and I was a production designer, so I would basically live there 2 all-nighters a week, and you'd be in the room and you'd do it together. And the thing was, it was a different kind of journalism, because you were living and breathing in this one space. There were actually typewriters, electric typewriters, and people would be typesetting all that. It was a marvelous technological ride. But the thing is, we put out this newspaper like this. And of course, things have changed remarkably. Now, at the time, Carleton still had a history of being one of the world's leading schools when it came to accessibility. Even today, many claim that Carleton is the most accessible school in North America. But some argue that the reason for that is, you know, this fact that we have all these things going on here, like the READY program, the READ initiative, the Paul Menton Center. These are all firsts in the world, and yet some people argue it comes back to the tunnels. I was just in the tunnels for the first time in a while. You know, here's the thing. After the Second World War, there was young, mostly men, who had gone off to fight. They were entitled to come back and get a free education. And there was an interesting cohort because they were about 4 to 5 years older than the other students because they'd been busy being soldiers. And they came back, and the thing was that some of them had suffered disabilities. Well, it turned out that Carleton just happened to be built with these wonderful tunnels, so you could move around from school to, from building to building, from school to school, from department to department in the winter, and it was very wheelchair friendly. So you know how when you're designing, things will slowly tip towards a certain group. And some people argue that Carleton's entire history of getting a conspicuous bias towards having people come to Carleton who live with disabilities started with the tunnels. And then because accommodation was required, they got better and better at it. And over the decades, before we know it, Carleton is now, it wins awards at knowing how to get this right. But back when I was at Carleton, it's like 1985, this is when I left the Charlatan, and I started this little graphic design studio down on Hopewell at Bank. It's now a Starbucks, but at the time, we had this old typesetting equipment and stuff. The thing is that when I came to Carleton, I didn't even know what a designer was. I just knew I really loved doing a layout, and I loved typography, and I was imagining that I could create these perfect little worlds of letters and columns and pages and margins, just so. And if I could make those perfect little worlds, I could shut out the rest of it. Well, it was kind of a denial approach, and it didn't take that long because my feminist girlfriend, pictured here, she argued strongly that designers were the root of most evil. We were up deep into the night arguing. She was saying, you know, you designers, you take women's bodies and you objectify us and you sell products with them and all that. And I was making all the typical arguments of, well, that's not our fault. It's our clients who ask us to do all that stuff. And I knew she was right in the end, so I started a thing. She got me to go to the Professional Society of Graphic Designers, the Graphic Designers of Canada, with a manifesto. And I went to the meeting in Ottawa. I'd never been to a meeting before. It was the annual general meeting. I came to the end and I said, any other business? And I said, why, what other business? What's the business? Well, I believe that the graphic designers are destroying the environment and feminism and social justice and all that. And this big argument ensued. There were graphic designers who were saying, that's not us, our clients asked us to do that. And this big argument goes on, and then the person who's charged of the local chapter comes over to me and says, you know, this is really good, but if you really want to get this changed, you have to actually get it changed at the national level. I said, oh, okay, how do we do that? And she said, well, you've got to be involved in the National Council and this. Well, before I knew it, she'd recruited me to help run the local chapter, which was her goal. But it took us 12 years. Of course, we had no email then, but it took us 12 years. But we actually developed the first code of ethics for graphic designers in the world that insisted that graphic designers were obligated, if they wanted to keep their professional accreditation, to take care of the environment and take care of gender issues and take care of a number of other things we identified then that were forefront. But it all started here. It started with her, and it started with realizing that it really doesn't matter what you design if it's not being designed for a purpose that is good for humanity. Well, things unfolded, and you know, fast forward now to today. Now, if I go to, I was hired by the Web Index, which is Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the guy who invented the web. He created the World Wide Web Foundation, and they do this thing every couple of years called the Web Index. And the Web Index is about measuring how well we're doing in terms of making the internet in a way that is good for the world. And we map the world. Now, what they were most interested in for me is there was just one portion of this which has to do with accessibility, because over the last few decades, my social justice thing and my design thing, and the fact that my colorblind thing, ended up migrating my graphic design career to a place where it became all about inclusive design, which is what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. But at the time, this survey had 4 questions about accessibility. And what they were doing was, we were looking at banking websites and government websites and cellular phone websites and measuring how countries were doing against each other when benchmarked to see how we do in the world. And the thing is that when you map it, it's no surprise that the winners at this, the winners who are figuring out how to make a web that is truly inclusive of everyone, is Canada and the United States, the Australians, Scandinavians, the UK, the Germans to some degree. And so if you do a Google Trend search on the term web accessibility and you dial it up by city, you find that, wow, Ottawa, that's us, ground zero for web accessibility. Why so? Well, Canada was the first country in the world where the federal government decided it would be against the law to have any public-facing web page that didn't comply with international standards so everyone could access them. And then Ontario was the first region in the world, the first jurisdiction in the world to pass legislation that says those kind of rules don't just apply to government, they should also apply to the private sector, NGOs, any organization over a certain size. And I'm going to unpack that for you, but because of that, you find Ottawa and Toronto in the top 7 or 8 cities in the world that are focused on the internet and what was on internet accessibility. And what resulted is that so much innovation has taken place right here in Ontario, whether it's in Ottawa, whether it's at Carleton, whether it's at IDRC, which is the Inclusive Design Research Center in Toronto, the first school in the world with a master's program in inclusive design. All of this is going on in Ontario because I believe because our governments have decided that this becomes mandatory, we as designers become excellent at that. And so you find tools such as, this is a tool that allows you to take a web page and simulate what it would look like if you didn't have typical vision. So I'm able to turn the dials and I can say, okay, let's pretend I'm 60 years old, or let's pretend I have a certain type of color blindness. And it can show you what the page would look like. This is another tool created here in Ontario. It's called A-Checker, and it allows you to take a website and run it through automated checking to see if the code seems to support standards for accessibility. This is a tool we developed right here in Ottawa. What we did is we wanted to create, it's actually started by a project that the city of Guelph hired us to do. The idea was that if you want to help people make accessible documents, it certainly would be helpful if there was a ribbon in Microsoft Word that brought together all the features you need to do the work, because there is some skill involved in creating accessible documents, but it's a whole lot easier if we bring together all the features in Word that are required to get it done. And so our ribbon, which is now available in English and French, it's a free download, and what it does, it's donationware, and people have to make donations to the READ initiative right here at Carleton. And we've got downloads from all around the world. And it also, I mean, half of it's bringing the functions together. The other half is simply the word accessibility is staring at you all day long. So that's kind of the sneaky communications plan. And we've also developed other clever ideas. For instance, I think, yeah, I need to you've got one of these. This is what we call the next card. It's our sneaky way of letting you know that we've got an upcoming course, our next course. But what we do is we've got it brailled, and we've included a cut in the corner. The cut on the corner of the card is an indicator to someone who can't see that within 3 inches of that cut, there's a QR code, which means that someone who is blind or has low vision can then take their mobile device out and check both sides for a QR code, and then that QR code leads them to a digital information which is the equivalent of what's ever on the card. So we do this on my business cards, we do this on these cards, we do it on certificates, and we've got people interested in 3 different levels of government on doing something that's so inexpensive to do, because QR codes are free, you can generate them. Putting a corner cut on a piece of paper costs next to nothing, and in that way we're able to help people be included. This is a technology designed right here in Ottawa. It's called Esight. It's also marketed out of Toronto. This is a young woman named Yvonne, and she has her eyes don't work in the typical fashion. And without these goggles, she couldn't really make her way in the world. But what she's got is she's got a pack on her waist, and the pack has 2 CPUs, each driving one of these lenses, and on the lens, what happens is there's a camera that picks up the information. It rearranges the content in a way that's meaningful to her, because the way her eyes work, she doesn't see anything in the middle. She only sees stuff out there. So what she's done through a feedback loop, they've figured out how to represent the information in a way that would be typical for us to her eyes. And they're both working away, and they work so quickly that she can actually walk through a space, and the audio and the video track is in sync. And this liberates people. Now, when Esight first came out with a pair of these goggles, they were like $30,000. Now they're almost down to $10,000, and it's coming down and it's coming down. So this is the type of technology that can liberate. And when I was, I've been telling, I traveled, I showed Yvonne's picture in many countries. And then I was at this trade show in Toronto, and I actually ran into her. I said, "Oh my goodness, you're the girl in the picture." And we discussed it, and she showed me how the goggles work, and I got to try them on. And it was so liberating. But the thing she said to me that was most profound is I was asking her, like, how many hours a day do you wear these? And she says, "Oh, you don't get it. I wear them all day long. Like, I feel I'm the person I'm supposed to be when I'm wearing this technology." She uses the lenses when she's surfing the web. It's part of who she is. And we live in a remarkable age. There's been perhaps 7,500 generations of human beings. And we live in the first generation where it's truly possible to include everyone. More people have been liberated in the last 30 years through remarkably designed objects than all the wars and all the revolutions in the history of humanity. It's such an awesome time to be alive. So imagine you're designing stuff, you're creating experiences, you're making things usable that weren't usable. And when we design for the extreme cases in a way that's thoughtful and created with a lot of sense, when we design for the extremes, we actually make better experiences for everyone. So I think, wow, we just happen to be alive in that 7,500th generation. We just happen to be in Ottawa at the nexus of accessibility research and thinking and design. We just happen to be in this wealthy economy where we have plenty of oxygen and plenty of food and everything. It makes me just think, wow, I mean, you can get all spiritual about it, or you can just say it's complete coincidence. Either way, I feel because we can do this thing, we really must do it. And so what happened in my career is I decided that there's also, when my parents taught me that social justice is not optional. But I ended up gravitating towards thinking, well, I'm living in this time of the ubiquitous internet. I'm living in the first decade, this is the first decade where the majority of humanity is online. And considering all the inventiveness that's occurred to date by, let's say, 30% of humanity, imagine what becomes possible when 100% of humanity is inventing something. So I ended up gravitating towards inclusive design because I thought, well, this is the time for it. And I ended up gravitating towards online inclusive design because I thought, here's the chance for the largest impact. I'm not saying there's only one choice. I mean, as designing folk, you choose something you're passionate about, and you align it with your skills and your competencies, and you find that thing you can specialize in. Well, this is what I ended up specializing in. And at the time we started out, these projects we would do, today we have awards programs for industrial design. Carleton kills this. But idea? Carleton kills this awards program year after year, takes all the top awards because Carleton is so good at inclusive industrial design. But when I was a designer, Carleton never heard of inclusive design or accessibility or these types of things. So it excites me that we're living in a time where things are moving so rapidly. If we went back 10, 11, 12 years, and I said to you, you know what, I bet you 12 years from now, if I walk through this library, I walk through these tunnels, there'll be recycle bins everywhere. Because back in 1980, whatever, when I had my little manifesto of the Graphic Designers of Canada, I was saying, we own this environmental thing. We're the designers, we're creating the pollution, and we're promoting the wrong products, but we can also help save the world. And if you said back then that there's going to be a a recycle bin in every room in the Macodrum Library, you'd say that's crazy, that's tree-hugging hippie talk. And yet that's the world we now live in. Well, I'm suggesting that when it comes to inclusive design, we're at that same point where it's rising and it's becoming mainstreamed, and a decade from now, it'll just be how we roll. We won't think about designing anything without making sure that everyone can use it. So when we were first starting out, well, we do these inclusive design projects, and they'd be what I call Robin Hood projects. We'd steal from the rich. You know, we'd get those big annual report jobs, and we get them done. And you'd take the money, and you'd donate stuff. You do pro bono work. But now, with all of this legislation in place, we've now got we're doing work for banks and big manufacturers and camera companies and governments and all, because everyone needs to make things inclusive. So something that used to be something that you do out of the kindness of your heart is now something you can completely embrace as a professional pursuit. Look, I want to show you an example of a piece of industrial design which strikes me worldwide. Here I'm showing pictures of your classic traffic signals viewed at night, moving at a bit of a speed. I took these pictures in Stockholm, but it could have been anywhere in the world where we have the classic traffic signals. And I'm just going to press this magic button. Now I've taken the color out of the picture. So now you're seeing what someone with a complete color deficit sees at night as they approach a traffic signal. Now, 10% of the male population of Ontario has some level of color deficit. And you know what the greatest source of accidental death is in our country? Guess. Traffic accidents. You know, we gotta get you guys talking about. I'm going to give you a prize for you know, this is my book, and we just produced a completely inclusive, accessible PDF ebook version of my book, and this is the e-card that you'd like buy in a library. This is the e-card for my book. Who are you?
Jordan.
Jordan. Hi. Thanks for speaking up, Jordan. Here's an accessible PDF of a book. So, yeah, traffic accidents. And so isn't this seems like a bit of a crazy design. Now, but if I go across the bridge to Quebec, as you guys all know, in Quebec, we have this better design. And it's not that we're not using the traditional red means go, red means stop, green means go approach to traffic signals. But for the legacy users, they get to use the old system. But we're also using the shape. You know, the stop lamps are squarish. The caution lamps are diamonds. The green lamps are round. As well, we're using the number of lamps. There's always 2 stop signals. There's only 1 go. So as you're approaching that from a distance, whether you have a color deficit or not, whether it's at nighttime, you know what's safe to do. And the legacy users are okay with it too. I mean, there wasn't I've lived in Ottawa most of my life, and Lois, do you remember them ever like delivering flyers to our doors saying, excuse me, starting Monday morning, if you go over to Quebec, you're going to have to learn how to use this, right? No, it's a piece of brilliant usability, and yet why don't we see them anywhere else in the world? Nowhere else on the planet. I've been to dozens of countries, I've never seen them anywhere. Once maybe in Alberta. So, and considering we have to replace all these traffic signals anyhow, because we're going to switch over to OLEDs everywhere for the sustainability, why doesn't the world embrace this life-saving design? So, you know, I was in Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, downtown Cambridge, and this is right down in the center. You see this symbol that means, what does this mean? What's it trying to tell us to do? What's the semiotics here? Don't turn left, right? Don't turn left. Well, yeah, no turn on red, right? So I tell you, I have no idea what color that is. So what is it saying to me? Kill yourself now, basically. Have you driven in Boston? It's not that. So one solution is to kill off all the colorblind people, and then we won't have to deal with them anymore. You know what the solution is in Massachusetts? Is actually you can't get a driver's license in Massachusetts if you're colorblind. I shite you not. Now that we've got to fix. But that's not the right solution. The right solution is that a traffic signal like this should not be legal in the United States of America. The United States has the most progressive accessibility legislation in the world, to their defense. It's an odd thing. So what do we do? Well, we're going to discover that when we're looking at eAccessibility, that is when we're looking at digital accessibility, that we use the same type of thinking. Just with the traffic signals, it's not that we can't use color as a way to communicate information, because most people find that a lot of fun. It's that we can't rely on color. But, you know, people perceive things in different ways, they learn things in different ways, they remember things in different ways. So if we use multiple modalities to get communication across, we get to include everyone and still delight everyone. And why wouldn't we do that? So when we think about the arguments for accessibility, I mean, of course, the core thing of just doing the right thing is one, but well, the first reason I dwell on accessibility is just because there's so many of us. How many Canadians are there now? Sorry? 34 million? All right. So it says it's about a gold medal per 1.3. No. So and how many people do you figure are living with a substantial disability? What proportion of the population do you figure lives with disability? 15%? 18%? Let's try 15%. So what's 15% of 34 million? It's a shitload of people, a lot of people, right? What is that? 15% of 34 million, what's that about? 3.4, carry the 1.7, 5.1. 5.1 million people. Is that right? Okay, that's a lot of people to not use your product or not read your website, because that's just bad marketing, bad design. The second reason we want to embrace accessibility is search and AI, because Google, the Google search agent, has the cognitive ability of perhaps a 3 or 4-year-old, getting better all the time. But you see, if we organize information in a way that subscribes to these accessibility standards that I'm going to show you, we also get better search. It means Google's more likely, its AI agent is more likely to say, oh, I understand what I'm looking at. And I'm confident it's the right match. And so you get better search results. The third reason is that we want to create a space where everyone can be involved in the process of creation. So it shouldn't be just enough that in the end we do all our things, in the end we have an accessible product. Every step of the way we want to have an accessible space so people living with disabilities can be part of the process of writing or designing or sketching or reading or identifying or curating, all the things that go into ideating. We want to create that process. And if we don't create an accessible space, people can't participate, so they're not going to show up. And and if you were saying 15% of the best minds on the planet can't be part of our work group, we're not going to compete so well against the next work group. So that's the third reason. The fourth reason is just the social justice argument. It's just the right thing to do. It's the love. And the fifth reason, though, is regulatory. And I mentioned early on that Ontario and Canada had passed some laws. I want to tell you more about those, because this is exciting stuff. Okay, law, well, I didn't choose to study law, but this is exciting to us in that what happened was way back in 2005, there was this act passed, but it took years to actually come up with specific rules on exactly what people had to do, what organizations had to do, what governments had to do. And there's actually 4 parts of this legislation. The AODA has 4 parts, and I get to work. I've been on this advisory council, and some other people from Carleton, like Dean Melway, who invented the READ initiative, was on the same council, and we work with the government to figure out what the standard should be going forward. Well, this information and communication standard focuses on accessibility in the eAccessibility space. Employment standards has to do with HR, transportation standards has to do with public transit systems, and there's also stuff about the design of buildings. But this is my this is my wheelhouse. So we focus on the Information and Communication Standard. And it's not just in Ontario. Other provinces, like Manitoba, came next in terms of choosing to embrace and set up these type of rules which specify what you got to do. And in fact, when Trudeau was elected Prime Minister, in his opening throne speech, he identified that a national act for inclusivity would be passed in his first term. And in fact, the federal government has promised that this year the draft of the act will be released. And we're expecting kind of like Ontario-style legislation that's going to apply to the whole country, which is pretty great. But this history of designing for accessibility goes back a long way. So I'm taking you back to this guy. Could you recognize this guy? He's a guy we love to claim as a Canadian. Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, indeed, yeah. Yeah, and you know, the thing is, when in 1876, when Bell, you know, we all think Bell invented the telephone, right? We can't live without our phones. But Bell didn't set out to invent a telephone. He just started, you know, his mom was deaf, and he came over from Scotland to help with assisting a certain school for the deaf and hard of hearing in Connecticut, and helping them figure out how can they teach deaf students better. And so this very specific extreme case, he ends up inventing the microphone and the amplifier and the transducer, and he ends up inventing every one of these components required. Now Bell dies, but he leaves behind this Nobel Prize winning Bell Labs, which, you know, in the 1930s, if you had a hearing aid, they keep working on hearing stuff at Bell Labs, so you had to wear this big thing around your neck, which didn't work so well, and it kind of has a big, like a billboard saying, hey, I have a hearing challenge. And so it wasn't until the 1940s that inventors at Bell Labs took the quantum physics that had arisen out of the war effort in the Second World War, and they were trying to invent something that was small and had a great signal to noise ratio that didn't take a lot of power. And they invented this better hearing aid. And they did it by creating this guy. You're familiar with him. Each of you is carrying about 2 million of them on your body, in your cell phones, in your smartphones. Transistors, yeah. They invent the transistor. And they get the job done. And they write, okay, we're done. Awesome hearing aid. And that's it. That would have been the end, perhaps, of the transistor for a long time, except this guy. Post-war Tokyo, Akio Morita says to himself, wait a minute. If people with an extreme situation like the idea of having a portable device that helps you hear stuff, maybe more people would like that. And so he buys up the worldwide rights to the transistor for $25,000 from Bell. His family thinks he's crazy, and he decides to invent the transistor radio. He also invents a company we now know as Sony. And Sony, the existence of this transistor radio makes it worthwhile for the rise of commercial radio, and then the rise of commercial television, and well, you know, transistors get us to the moon and back, but it all starts with someone designing for the extremes. It also means I could listen to the Montreal Expos games while staying up all night. Okay, that doesn't make sense. But working at the Charlatan, I remember having the radio there and listening to the Expo games and listening to the audio description. And I was always amazed at how I could listen to that description of a baseball game and be completely captivated by it, just as captivated as if I was there in person. And it wasn't until earlier this year that it dawned on me that when a blind person is hearing an audio description of a film or a video, it's just as vivid an experience as it was for me to just live and die over whether the Expos were going to hear a crack of a bat or an announcement, and a very skilled Duke Snyder giving real-time audio description. But I digress. So all these assistive technologies which rise, this girl's wearing what's called a SipPuff device. And this SipPuff device allows that if she's, well, imagine if you're a quadriplegic, which means you have either no use of your limbs below your neck, or maybe very slight use of your limbs. But with this SipPuff device, the way it works is if you move your head, that's like moving the mouse. And when you blow on the tube, it's like left-clicking. And when you suck on the tube, it's right-clicking. And so using a SipPuff device, it's possible to navigate any website or software. Well, not any website, any software that complies with these international standards for accessible stuff. And indeed, there's been all these remarkable assistive technologies developed, and it's been the internet that's made it possible for them to become ubiquitous. Are you familiar with the digital divide, the concept of the digital divide? Anyone want to bring a definition? What do we mean by this? It's an economics problem. Yes?
From my communications theory,
yeah.
understanding, digital divide is like the haves and the have-nots when it comes to internet. And from at least, it was in the context of developing countries and developed countries.
Yeah.
So it was like, there's a strict divide that's separating the people who have access to internet and education and all the other things, and then the other, it's like widening even more so, and it becomes more severe, the side effects of not having access to internet and other types of digital technology.
Brilliant. I'm gonna amplify what you said for everyone maybe didn't hear it. But in general, it's the idea that although technology is awesome, because technology is so powerful, because being part of the digital community is so powerful, it further divides economically people who are poor and wealthy, because if the wealthy have all this stuff and the poor don't have it, the gap is even greater. Fair enough? Have I paraphrased fairly? And indeed, there's a professor I really admire, Peter Brook. He's a friend from Austria. And he describes the technological progression that has brought us to where we are today in terms of 4 screens. The first screen was a movie screen, and it's like we are, imagine, we're in a theater type arrangement like this, and we're all watching the same thing, and we're taking that in. And when that came along, that was pretty awesome. And it took decades until the second screen came along, which was the television screen. Now, the television screen allowed more personalization of the user experience, because now I could choose a channel, I could choose to turn it on and off, I could adjust the volume, but it was still only so many things and only certain things coming on at a certain time. But that was so amazing that the television propagated globally at a speed like we've never seen before. It took radio decades to propagate. It took 7 years to go to the point where the majority of communities on the planet had television. And then the third screen, Peter Brook's third screen, was the laptop, the computer screen, because it meant that people could have truly interactive experiences. I'm not preaching to the choir here, but we define interactivity in terms of not being able to predict what's going to happen. Well, there it is. And so suddenly we have the ubiquitous, affordable computers. But it's the fourth screen. It's the mobile screen that is truly revolutionary. Because I mentioned earlier that we're in the first decade where the majority of people will be online, and for the majority of humanity, it's the small screen device where the first internet experience is going to occur and where the innovation is going to occur. So when I bring this back to, excuse me, so when I bring it back to, I was a judge at a conference in Delhi, and our job was to decide amongst all of this remarkable innovation that had occurred in projects developed throughout the developing world. We saw all sorts of amazing immersive video spaces and goggles you could wear and virtual reality and all that. But there was one project I gave my gold thing to, and it was this project called Pedigree. And I want to explain it to you because in Ghana, well, I want you to imagine someone you know. It could be your child. Imagine a 2-year-old you know. Could be a nephew, a niece, child. Imagine the 2-year-old wakes up in the middle of the night screaming in pain. You have no idea what's wrong, and they don't have the words to tell you what's wrong. And if as a parent or as a relative, you're just beside yourselves. Well, we live in a community where you pick up your phone and you call the Ontario Nursing Hotline and Telehealth Ontario, and you talk them through it and they explain the situation. They say, oh, yeah, go to the 24-hour Shoppers Drug Mart pharmacy and go get this drug and bring it to you. You give the drug, and you get the drug, and you bring it to the child, and you give them the drug, and they're fine again. Life is good. Well, in Ghana, same situation, except in Ghana, 25% of the pharmaceuticals are fake, are counterfeit. So imagine that same scenario, and you rush to the all-night pharmacy, and you get the drugs, but you don't know if they're real or not. You don't know if you're going to give these drugs to your very uncomfortable child. Will it make them better? Will it do nothing at all? Will it hurt them? That's a horrible, undignified place to be. So these guys came up, this group called Pedigree came up with this idea. And I've got one of the things that's basically a scratch code that goes on the side of each pill bottle. And there's a unique code there. And what happens is when you're at the pharmacy, you get your prescription, and then you take out your phone, and you text this certain number, you text this code, and it sends back to you a yes or a no. It's either real or it's fake. They got the pharmaceutical companies involved, and with one piece of clever design, no colors, just a 128-character SMS message that costs a cent to send in Ghana is the difference between people living and dying, between dignity and lack of dignity. And that to me is online, beautiful, socially justice accessibility. The thing is that the usage of the mobile screen has shifted so much that, you know what a screen reader is? You ever heard of a screen reader? It's a technology that someone who can't see or perhaps can't read uses to have something read out loud to them. And it used to be that if you were going to use a screen reader, you had to use a desktop computer. But what we found now is the global shift is so much that the majority of screen reader use now is using screen readers that are free and they're on mobile. So, for example, if you were to count the number of hours, if you have a friend who's blind and you counted how many hours they spend on a screen reader on a desktop versus on their mobile device, they're spending more time on the mobile device. And that's phenomenal because it means that they can be moving in the physical space. They can be on the bus. They can be wherever and be able to more fully immerse themselves. The other thing is it cuts down the digital divide. Because it used to be, for example, if I wanted a device that could tell you what color my pants were, because I'm not really sure what color these pants are, and I'm going to be in front of an audience, so I've got to make sure, well, my rule is you just wear only one color tops and black, and you're good. But if I wanted to have a device that would tell me what color my pants were, they'd be $149. That was 8 years ago. Now it's a $4 mobile app. And it's so much the case that so many of the accessibility inventions have become so affordable. And so it takes away the barrier. Meanwhile, as the technologies become affordable, as it becomes possible to 3D print an artificial limb for $15 in Jaipur, instead of having to have a custom made for you in Boston for $6,500, when that becomes possible, it means also the same technologies fall into the mainstream. So the Siri and the Google Home that we all love so much are based on technologies that were originally developed for people with extreme auditory challenges or extreme interface challenges. And so we find that the same technologies, just like Bell, ended up stringing together a whole bunch of inventions, and we end up getting all phones out of the deal. So it is that when we design for the extremes, everyone benefits. And indeed, we have this variety of disabilities. So, I was saying earlier that when we talked about 15%, like how many people is that? And in fact, most disability is not, I'd like to do a quick experiment if I could with all of you. This is it. I want to get a sense of how many people in this room are living with a substantial disability. Are you okay with that? Because what I want to do, this is the game. I want to suggest, I'll list off a number of things. And then, after I've listed them, I'll ask you to self-identify if you have at least one of those things. And we'll see how many people of us actually have one of these things. I'll ask you to stand up, or if you can't stand up, you put up your hand. You're into this? Here's my list. Are you blind? Are you colorblind? Are there certain, do you wear glasses? Have you had laser eye surgery? Do you have trouble reading the small type? The small type way up here in the front of the room. Do you have a hearing challenge? Do you, can you not hear at all? Are you hard of hearing? Do you have trouble hearing just in one certain ear since a certain Genesis concert in high school? Do you spend most of your day in a wheelchair? Do you have a cognitive challenge, ADD, ADHD, dyslexia? Was English, I'm presenting in English, was English not the first language you learned in life? Are you bored with my list? Okay, are you pregnant? Are you drunk? Are you stoned? There's all kinds of things going on. Look, you could add more things, but if you have any of these things, I got 2.5 of these things, you probably figured out already, please stand up or put up your hand. Let's see how many people we are. Okay, keep your hands up. Let's look around. What do you think? 15%? What do you think? 91% maybe? Does anyone not have their hand up? Are you, just a sec, are you planning on living past the age of like 40? Because, you know, see, we're living in this aging population, and the fact is the life expectancy in 1700s in Europe was 36 for a male. And yet we're all planning on living forever, or at least like for 80, 90. You know, this is the thing. So we look at disability. There are permanent disabilities. There are also temporary disabilities. And then there are the ones we acquire as we age, and then society also gives a hard time to the left-handed people, stuff like that. So if you organize them, if you organize in the order of how we deal with them, we have a series of assistive technologies. And what we tend to do is we say, well, if you can't see the green and red lamps, let's swap in another way of communicating. And typically with assistive technologies, what we do is we swap in another sense that's not available, either permanently or temporarily, or we amplify one. And so, for example, if we can't read small things, we make them larger. Or if I can't type, I'll use my voice, and Alexa will interpret it for me. If I can't move my limbs, I can sip, I can pop, I can blink, I can type on an on-screen keyboard. You know, this technology here, NRC, local government, one step away from NSERC. This is a technology that was developed in Ottawa, and it tracks where you're, it's called the mouse, and that's because it's a combination of nose and mouse. And the nose is, it's tracking where your nose is, which means it knows where you're looking. And then when you blink, that's the click. So that's a cool technology. So much that Lenovo is threatening to add this technology to all their laptops over the next few years. So that's going to be wild, watching people do that at their laptops. So, and then we have, so I mentioned this legislation, and the part of it I really wanted to dwell on for you was that, so we live in this province now where you have to comply by these deadlines. One deadline already passed, but by 2021, every organization in the province that has at least 50 people has to comply with this standard. And the standard is something called WCAG 2, and I don't know how deep, I'm just going to show you a few examples of this, but it's basically the global standard for accessible things. Have you heard of this thing, WCAG? So you've been there? Okay, so the part I wanted to unpack is the internationalness of it. You know, Canada was the first government in the world, but everywhere you go on the planet, people are, any legislation we can find, I studied legislation from over 50 countries for that web index thing. Everyone is pointing to some flavor of WCAG 2, whether it's level A, double A. And it means that if you learn this stuff, it's going to be worth knowing wherever you're working, wherever you're going to get a job, in any country, in any profession. This is the standard that people are learning. Now, of course, you can be a leader in this area, but to know it is worth knowing. So, the WCAG standard is broken up into groups of rules, and the rules basically say if you have a level A compliant product, you've complied with 25 level A rules. If you have a double A compliant product, you've complied with an additional 13 level double A rules, and together, so that's 38 rules. And level double A is pretty well what all governments are choosing ultimately. You can also go to AAA, but to create a AAA compliant product, usually there are trade-offs. And the promise I make to designers who work with us is that we can take any product and get it to AA without trade-offs. Because the biggest fear we have is, understandably, whether people are writers or translators or UX designers, they're afraid that when they're through putting these things into place, their designs are going to suck. Their products are going to be boring. They're going to lack the drama and the intrigue. Well, what we found is that we can take any product and get all the A's and double A's fulfilled in a way that either is neutral for the typical user or makes the product even better for everyone. And that's what we're very proud of doing. And I just wanted to show you I'm going to finish off with showing you a couple of examples of how we've achieved that. So for example, FixMyStreetCA was a website, a public website, where the idea of crowdsourcing information about, let's say, there's a pothole on your street. You could say, oh, there's a pothole right here, and then the municipal government could embrace that. So we were working with the city, and we ended up developing Service Ottawa, is our city of Ottawa. We develop these applications in a way which is fully accessible. So it means that anyone, whether on the desktop or using responsive design, can report an animal corpse in the road or a pothole or whatnot. And what it resulted is not just happier citizens who are more engaged and are kind of pleased to be able to do something about it, but they were actually able to drive down the cost of running the city substantially. Instead of having people having to drive around looking for potholes, the people tell you about the potholes. It's kind of a brilliant approach to fully accessible crowdsourcing. Here's a site we did. We've done over 16 sites for the city of Ottawa, so we're kind of moving through them and making sure they're all compliant. The city of Ottawa is a real leader in this case. Here's an example of what a site looked like before we started our process of discovering all the gaps for accessibility and making sure the designers had to redesign it in a way that would be more accessible. Well, here's the resulting site. When it was done, that journey brought us to a product which looked much more interesting, was more easy for anyone to use, and is a lot more inviting. So that's the result of accessibility work. Now look at the economic consequences of this one. We were working on this web strategy for the Canada Revenue Agency, and you can imagine there's no website that's busier during tax season in the country than the Canada Revenue Agency site. It's a big deal. So Canada Revenue Agency decides they're going to spend a lot of money working on usability and accessibility, redevelop the whole site. Because although it cost a lot of money to do that work, the reality is that every time in tax season you call the government, you say, I don't understand this form, or I can't find this thing on the website. It costs us $26 every time they answer the phone. But if someone can self-serve, they can find something on their own, and they can be confident that they found all there was to find, which is the real tricky thing in search, it only costs us 6 cents. So by creating a more accessible, usable web presence, we're able to save millions of dollars, as well as having happier citizens. Who doesn't want that? So we've got these cases where we can deliver what I like to refer to as the accessibility dividend. Because if you only go so far with this stuff, yeah, it's extra work and it's extra trouble and all that. But if you go deep enough that you've actually created a better UX for everyone, is a huge payoff. Not just in terms of not getting sued, not just in terms of doing the right thing, not just in terms of including everybody, but actually you save money, you increase profit. And I argue, when we're at these Ontario government meetings, I actually argue that in this 77,500th generation of humanity, that here in Ontario we're actually making a more competitive province. not only are we creating a whole industry where we're leading the planet at this, and as governments come on stream, we can export our wisdom and our brilliance and our techniques, but it's forcing Ontario's governments and Ontario's NGOs and Ontario's businesses to actually work better, which makes them more competitive. So once you start being able to make that business case, doesn't have to be a, oh, you really ought to do this, it's the nice thing to do. No, it's just good process, it's sustainability. So I'm excited to be a part of this, and I'm excited to say that it all started for me here at Carleton, and I love the idea to take any questions you have about any of this, because I'd love to convince you to just ramp this up. What do you think? You have any? That's it. Questions? You got questions, Lois?
Yeah. So in my course last semester, you were one of the people the students interviewed.
Right. Yeah.
And we set up a blog,
Mm-hmm.
which hasn't actually gone public yet because we don't have all the permissions from everyone who was interviewed. And then we said, okay, well, how do we make this? How do we know for sure if it's accessible? And somebody said, well, I think you should look at David Berman's material on the Paul mentioned.
Oh, the videos.
Yeah.
Yeah. We taped 3 days of videos on how to comply with WCAG 2, and they're available to everyone in the Carleton community.
Mm-hmm.
They're online. They're getting a little old. We're working on new stuff, but yeah.
Okay. But it's very time consuming to do that. It would have been much better if we had, from the very beginning, said these are the principles that we want to apply while we're designing instead of redesigning. So how do you get that message out to have people think accessibly from the beginning, or design, like, are there like 10 basic principles, 5 basic principles?
You want people to cook it in from the get-go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. You know, we often see projects like, and it happens with legacy projects. Someone's got this thing and it already exists, and now they gotta fix it. And you know, or just because of a lack of experience, you know, you go through your whole design process. You know, you start with orientation, and you do your information architecture, your conceptualization, your strategy. Sorry, you start with strategy. Oops. You start with your strategy, your measurable objectives, your information architecture, your writing, and your graphic design, and your fabrication, and your loop. And then somewhere in production, someone says, oh yeah, we have to make this accessible. Well, there isn't a more expensive or ineffective or painful way to do it than to do it last. So what we try to do is teach people how to cook it in every step of the way. And you know, it starts out with your strategies. You know, when you're doing your brief, when you're first developing the product and you're deciding who's my target audience, you have to think about, well, does this group is it going to trend towards certain challenges, certain histories, certain age groups, certain levels of knowledge, certain cognitive? You think about it right there. But you know, it becomes a habit, just like environmentally sustainable design becomes a habit. Right from the get-go, you're thinking about what materials you're going to use. It becomes just part of how you roll. Every step of the process has an inclusivity approach to it. Are you convinced?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm convinced on that part, but I want something like a one-page thing. I want maybe like a QR code I could just pull up and say, do this, do that, do this.
Well, so some of the principles, like don't rely on color to communicate solely. That's pretty easy to get used to. Some of them are quite nerdy though. Like, you know, deep stuff, like let's say you're writing an HTML5 or you're creating PDF files, or, well, there's actually a lot of tricky code to make sure that, let's say, for Canada Revenue Agency, for example, all of the forms, all the tax forms, they're all completely fill-inable, readable, interpretable, and fillable, and even submittable independently by someone who's never seen it in their life. That's amazing, but to make that happen in an interactive form, that actually takes a lot of skill and specialization. So I wouldn't want to trick you into thinking, oh yeah, this stuff is easy, because some of it's tricky and some of it isn't. But Lois, I'm intrigued. I think you're right. Could we do that together? Could we make a little project where we would create your checklist?
Next semester.
Because, you know, the challenge I get is this. I fear that people take the easiest parts and they go, oh yeah, I'll do the color thing, and I'll do the, oh yeah, I'm going to make sure type sizes are a certain size, and I'm going to make sure I use sans serif rather than serif typefaces, but this other stuff that's got to get done, it's kind of scary, they'll avoid. So in truth, the most important thing one can do before one starts is making sure you either have the competencies you need for a particularly sophisticated project to be fully accessible, or you make sure your team includes someone who knows that stuff. So, you know, just like any other, you know, let's say your product involves complex circuit boards. Well, it doesn't mean everyone's got to know how to solder, but you at least have to have one person on the team that's going to make sure everyone else isn't going to kill themselves learning how to solder. And it's like that. You want to make sure that expertise is present. I think that's a fair response.
Thank you.
Yes?
I have a related question because I am conducting an online survey and I decided on an online platform already available which states they are fully accessible by users of screen readers. But unfortunately, during the course of the online survey being open to the public, I got some participants complaining about the lack of accessibility of the online survey platform.
Right.
And I would like to know if you have any kind of advice in terms of verifying when you already have a website or a tool that you want to use, if it is really accessible for the blind.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I've got a video that you can watch. It takes about an hour, and it's called David's 11.5 favorite free accessibility testing tools. And if you email me, then I will I'll send you the link to it, and or if there's a way, Lois, we can share that with everyone. But essentially, what I've done is collected my favorite accessibility testing tools, and so I go through them and I explain what they are. But in terms of wanting to simulate the experience of someone who's blind, then or with someone with low vision, my best suggestion is if you're on a Windows computer, that you download a free screen reader. It's called NVDA, and that's the most popular screen reader now on the planet, and it's free. It's open source, and you can quickly learn how to experience what it's like to use a screen reader. But essentially, if you can put your mouse aside and just use the keyboard only, that itself is a great test, because you see, if someone has a mobility challenge, then they can't use a mouse because they don't have the flexibility to move it around, so they're going to use keyboard shortcuts and stuff. Or they're going to use, even if they're using a foot pedal, it's always going to be equivalent to some press on the keyboard. So if you can completely operate something with keyboard only, that says a lot. Now, if someone can't see, it's not that they have the mobility challenge, it's that functionally, because they can't see, it's not realistic for them to use a mouse because they can't see the position of the pointer. So again, they tend to use a keyboard-only approach to things. Now, some of these survey softwares, they'll claim they're accessible, and the challenge is that, you know, in a survey you can have different types of activities. So maybe all the, like if you can set up a page with radio buttons or checkboxes, that's accessible, but if there's a drag and drop activity, that's not accessible. So it can be gray depending on how you use the tool.
In my case, what I did was to actually ask for blind people to test the survey for me. So they tested in a computer and also in mobile using VoiceOver in Apple and also JAWS in Windows.
Yeah.
And they could complete the survey with no problem. But it seems in some specific cases when JAWS is used in a specific browser, the online platform doesn't work.
Right.
It's not a matter of like not working properly, but
Yeah.
actually not reading anything on screen. So the screen reader just reads the title of the survey. It's not.
So this stuff can be crazy making, and Lois, this is what I was trying to kind of get at. Like when we audit a product, because there's a lot of what we do these days is, you know, a company will say, you know, is our mobile app or our document or our website accessible? And we've got drawers full of equipment. So we'll say, well, what are your target platforms? So if they're targeting, let's say, Mac OS and iOS and Android and Windows 10 or going back a certain distance, we'll then pair that up with certain assistive technologies. So it makes sense that you're testing on JAWS and NVDA on Windows, and on Mac OS and iOS you're testing on VoiceOver, and on Android you're testing on TalkBack. And we'll go through each of them, and you will find these situations where, oh, it all works perfectly, and even we followed all the coding rules, and still on JAWS 9 running on Windows 7.1 in this browser, it breaks. And sometimes even you've done everything right and it still breaks, but because the majority of the audience uses JAWS, you'll still go to the trouble of fixing it. So it can be imperfect. We want our goal is to create products that everyone can use using any browser, any technology, any bandwidth, any operating system, and you'll never get there. Like I don't want you to feel intimidated by this accessibility ideal. That's why I love WCAG too, because it doesn't describe the most awesome, it describes the minimum standard. Of course you want to exceed it, but you know that if your product meets that standard or exceeds it, you're part of the solution, not part of the problem. Because in reality, if there's a bug in JAWS, where your product works on all these other things, it's reasonable for you to have a message on the very first screen that says, for the most accessible experience of this product, please use it on this or this or this, on that or that or that. Well, you guys continue to work out why this bug in JAWS is holding you up. That's reasonable. It's not perfect. Of course, we prefer everyone can use it everywhere. But you've created a way that everyone can use it. That's a great thing.
As you know, there is like many emerging technologies, right? Like VR,
yeah,
other stuff. Sometimes we feel like when design such technologies, the most important or the focus for the people who work on inventing such technologies, they focus on the interaction in itself, in a way that we want to make sure that this technology is work, or the interaction techniques is work. After a while, we realize maybe this kind of technology might not work with people with disability. So what I'm trying to ask in different way, to what extent you believe that adhering to accessibility guidelines will limit the use of a new emerging technology?
Well, creating accessible experiences typically has three things coming together. The designers are creating content in a way that the content is designed in an accessible manner. And this WCAG standard, WCAG, is the Web Content Authoring Guidelines. So that's our job. There's also another standard called the ATAG, which is for making sure that authoring tools are accessible. And there's yet another one called UUAG, which makes sure that the user agent, UAAG, the user agent accessibility guidelines. It's the job of, so the person who creates Chrome or Firefox or Safari, their job is to make sure that they've built in the hooks so that you can bring your accessible content. If all three of them come together, we have a fully accessible experience. And what we're finding is, in industry, no one's developing new emerging technologies that don't comply with UAAG because they know they're just not going to make it. So many organizations will just simply not embrace them. It's possible that maybe during prototyping, alpha testing, beta testing, they'll stay there just like anything. I mean, just like you'd have a document that isn't spelled right in the first drafts, but eventually it's going to have to be spelled perfectly. It's the same thing. So we're not finding that that's a big issue, that the technologies fall into place because the marketplace is demanding that if you don't come to the game with products that comply with W3C standards, you're not going to be able to survive. So it actually hasn't been a big problem. Now, I also want to bring.
For the researcher, it could be a problem.
That is true. You know, it's true. In research, you're dealing with chaos often. I understand that. But the point I want to bring as well is that we have to make sure to remember that we don't have to create the same experience for everyone. We have to create an equivalent experience. So, for example, if Google Street Maps of, like, I don't know if it's here yet, but can you street map inside the Code Room library yet? I don't know, but give it a few years and you'll be able to. So an accessible equivalent to that, that's a real tall challenge. So if it was the case that every place I move my mobile phone or I'm looking at it and I point it around, that there would be an audio description of everything I see, we're not there yet. But Google instead said, okay, if we can't create that in an accessible way, we're going to create other technologies that would help someone who can't see navigate the building in other ways. And so that way everyone gets the business outcomes they need. It's like if you ever watch the captioning in a movie or you listen to the audio description, you'll find that it doesn't match perfectly. Sometimes the timing's off. All they're doing is making sure that everyone experiences the same edutainment or knowledge they get out of the presentation, even though it's presented in a different way. And so often with emerging technologies, we'll be saying, you're not going to get that experience from this source, but you'll get it from here instead.
So I guess as a younger kind of designer and someone that's not making big decisions, how can I be like an accessibility advocate at my level? Is it focusing on that sort of like baseline level of accessibility, like in my own practices and planning? How do I don't know, be more mindful of accessibility in the products that I contribute to, I guess?
So the question is how, while your sphere of influence is relatively small and growing, what can you do to be an advocate to try to influence people to embrace inclusive design? Well, one thing I find that almost anyone can do is once you get to know this stuff, you just start seeing it everywhere. Just like, any form of design, you see a door that goes the wrong way and you just notice it. But online, it's so easy to complain. Not complain in a nasty way, but complain in a loving way. So I find myself filling out a form and it's frustrating me. I find myself putting in the comments area, oh, and by the way, I find it took me 3 times as long to fill out your form as it should have because your site doesn't comply with international standards, and if you're interested in knowing more about this, contact me. But meanwhile, yes, I will buy your whatever, right? Or I'm sorry, I couldn't buy your thing. Or I'll sometimes even do this, which is kind of coy. I'll say, this form is impossible for someone who's blind to fill out. But contact me if you want me to buy your product. Now, I didn't say I was blind, because I'm not. But I'm kind of saying that's impossible, because I know enough to say there's no way someone who couldn't see could have gotten through that process. And business or government or whomever is going to wake up and say, oh my goodness, we had no idea, because it's usually not out of malevolence, it's out of ignorance. And so I find there's an awful lot of opportunity online for advocacy just by doing that. Just speak up whenever, and the more you get good at it, the more you have the confidence to say, oh yeah, there's no way that's a usable UX. Because typically, when the super users, the person with an extreme challenge, can't use something at all, it's usually something that's a pretty big hurdle for everyone. Like we're all going, oh, I hate this thing. But for some people, they can't use it at all. And so it's always typically good business to, when you design for those extreme users, you design it in a way that everyone's going to enjoy it more. Well, who doesn't want all of their audience to enjoy their products more? So that's it. Yeah. Well, it's cool. As Canadians, we really do, in many ways, lead the planet on this topic. So although we are often seeing places where we're weak, that should be better, when I travel, people are saying, how are you guys doing this thing? What are you doing? And we're going to have to come up with the lowest sheet. Anyway. So I think I'm saying once we figure this thing out, we'll share it globally.
That's great.
Where do you start? Yeah.
Well, we wanted to thank you for this really interesting talk, and I'm sure if you guys have more questions, you might be able to.
Yeah, I'll stick around for as long as there's questions.
It's getting a little late, and so we really appreciate you coming here and discussing this topic. It's very important, and sort of, it was really good to get your perspective on this. So
Well, thanks so much for allowing me to be here.